Before beginning the story, I'd like to say a big thank you for visiting my new channel. I'm going to be uploading alternate history-related stories every single day. If that sounds good, be sure to leave a like and don't forget to subscribe. It means a whole lot when just getting started. I hope you enjoy the story. The Carrow Tower was 16 floors of mid-century ambition that hadn't aged as well as its architects intended. It had been something once, full to capacity inside its first year, the kind of address that meant something on a letterhead. That was a long time ago. By the time I became its superintendent, it was already in the early stages of its long retreat. Tenants leaving for newer buildings with better systems and lower rates. Whole floors going dark and staying dark. The lobby directory accumulating blank lines the way a face accumulates lines. Slowly, then noticeably, then in a way you stopped pointing out because pointing it out didn't help anything. I'd managed its decline for 11 years. Before that, I'd worked in it for 6 as facilities coordinator under the previous superintendent, a man named Garth, who retired somewhere warm and sent me one postcard. I'd come up in the Carrow Tower. I knew every system in it, every floor, every piece of aging infrastructure held together by my working knowledge of what was holding and what needed watching. I knew which corridor on 5 had a draft in winter that no weather stripping had ever fixed. I knew which breaker on 8 was getting unreliable. I knew the building the way you know a person you've worked alongside for a long time. Not completely, never completely, but in the close, specific way of someone who has been paying attention for years and intends to keep paying attention. The service elevator was the oldest thing in the building. It predated the 2 modern passenger lifts by 30 years, a manually operated car with a folding gate and a brass indicator panel that had been retrofitted into the existing shaft when the tower was constructed. The story was that the shaft had already been there, that the building had been designed around something already on the site. I'd never verified it from the records and eventually stopped trying. I used the elevator for freight and maintenance, occasionally for moving equipment between floors when the main lifts were occupied. It was slow and loud and unreliable in cold weather, and I had long since made my peace with all of that. I was not at peace with it running on its own. It was a Wednesday night in late October, quiet in the way the Carrow Tower had gotten quiet in recent years. 3 tenants left on the occupied floors, all of them gone by 7, the building mine, for the night. I was in the basement chasing a water pressure inconsistency in the main supply line that had been showing up in the readings for the past week. Not an emergency, but the kind of thing that became one if you were patient with it for too long. The service elevator shaft was on the far wall of the mechanical room. I heard the car moving before I saw the indicator, the specific sound of the cable working through the drum, unmistakable after 17 years. I stood up from the panel I'd been crouched over. The indicator needle was cycling through floor numbers on its own, up, then down, then up again, not stopping anywhere, just moving through the building with the steady patience of something running a familiar route. I hadn't run that elevator in 3 weeks. I opened the gate. The car was at basement level. Inside stood a figure in a dark uniform with white gloves and a cap bearing the Carrow Tower's original logo, the logo from the opening decade, the one that had been replaced in the 70s, that I knew only from photographs in the building's archive. The face beneath the cap was unremarkable in the specific way of someone designed to be looked at without being seen. A service professional. Easy to look at, easy to trust, nothing that would give you reason to look twice or look away. It looked at me and asked what floor. I had a junction box on the second floor I'd been meaning to check all week. The question was delivered with such complete professional neutrality, such ordinary helpful expectation, that I answered it before I'd made a decision to. I said 2. The gate closed. The car went up. The second floor, as I'd left it 2 hours ago, was dark and had been empty for 5 years. The doors opened onto something else entirely. Full. Occupied. The offices behind the frosted glass partitions lit and running. People moving in the corridors with the purposeful energy of a building between 9 and 5 on a productive day. The carpeting was a burgundy I recognized immediately, a color that had been replaced sometime mid-decade with something more neutral and less interesting. The directory plaque listed company names that had been gone for years. A man walked past the elevator carrying a stack of folders and didn't look at me. Not in the way of someone ignoring a person, but in the way of someone for whom I wasn't quite in the same layer of the building they were in, present to them in some peripheral way that didn't require acknowledgement. I stood at the open gate and did not step off. Behind me, the attendant waited, white gloves at its sides, cap perfectly level. I said basement. We went down. I found Theo Boland on the 6th floor at 11 o'clock, sitting on the floor with his back against the wall and a flashlight between his knees. He looked up when he heard me come off the elevator, and the relief on his face didn't try to disguise itself as anything else. He said, "You're from now?" I said, "Yes." He said, "How long ago is now?" I told him the date. He put his face in his hands for a moment. Then he said he'd been in the building for 3 days. Theo had been an architect. His firm had occupied the 9th floor for 12 years before relocating downtown, which he mentioned with the even tone of someone who had made peace with a loss long enough ago that the peace had calcified into fact. He'd come back to the Carrow Tower on a Monday morning to collect drawings from a storage unit on the 4th floor. Work from the years his firm had been here. Things he'd been meaning to retrieve for so long that retrieving them had become its own kind of project. He'd found the service elevator in the basement, gate open, car waiting, and ridden it up, out of simple curiosity, because the freight elevator he'd meant to use was locked out for a maintenance cycle. He'd stepped off on the 4th floor and found the building from 2 years ago, still recognizable, still close to the present, but wrong in the small ways that placed it behind him rather than around him. He'd gone back to the elevator and tried the other floors, working his way down, looking for the current year. The ground floor was the problem. Every time he tried to exit there, the lobby was a year behind, sometimes 2, never now, and each attempt had pushed it further back. He'd been eating from the vending machine on the 4th floor, which in whatever year that floor was running was stocked and functional. He'd been sleeping in a vacant office on the 6th, the most recent year he could reliably access, close enough to the present that the building still felt like the building he knew. 3 days, alone in the building's past. He looked like a man who had been holding something heavy for longer than his arms were built for. I got him a coffee from the vending machine and sat down on the floor beside him and listened to everything he'd figured out, which was more than I'd expected and not quite enough to get us out. I rode the car alone for an hour after that, keeping my visits to each floor brief, trying to understand the mechanism before I did anything with it. On the 5th floor, I found the building from 7 years ago, the carpeting newer than I remembered it, the upper floors still showing signs of life. On the 10th, I found it at full capacity, back in the years it had been built for, every office occupied, every corridor purposeful, the building doing exactly what it had been designed to do. I walked the 10th floor for a few minutes and felt the specific weight of a place that still believed in itself. And I went back to the car and set the ground floor and got the lobby from 4 years ago. 6 rides. The ground floor had drifted back with each one. I stopped riding and stood in the basement and thought about it, the way I thought about any building problem. What it was doing, what was driving it, what the variable was that I could actually affect. Something was being fed by the rides. Something was accumulating from each floor I visited and using it to pull the exit further from the present. I thought about Theo's 3 days of riding up and down, looking, wanting, feeding the system without knowing he was feeding it. I thought about my own 6 rides and how much ground the floor had lost in just one evening. I went back to the attendant with a direct question. I asked what it was and what the elevator did to the people who rode it. It told me the floors and the years they corresponded to, all 16 of them, mapped from the building's first year of operation to the present being the ground floor. It delivered this with the thoroughness of a building directory. Every floor accounted for, every year named precisely. Then it asked what floor. I asked what happened if someone chose a floor and stayed there. It said the door would close when I was ready to continue. I asked how long it had been running this car. It said it was here to take me to my floor and asked which floor that was. The face beneath the cap was patient and professionally pleasant and completely untroubled. I understood then that this wasn't a limitation. It was the total shape of what the attendant was. It existed entirely in the dimension of service. What floor? Here we are. The door will close when you're ready. It would answer any question about the elevator's operation completely and accurately. It simply had no dimension in which the consequences of that operation were its concern. It was here to take you where you wanted to go. Where you wanted to go was the problem. All it had to do was ask the floor and wait for you to name the one that cost you something to name. I went back to Theo. I told him what I thought was happening, that the elevator collected wanting, the specific weight of longing that built up when you walked through a year of this building that meant something to you. Every floor either of us visited that we had a reason to care about gave it something to work with, and the more it had, the further back it pulled the exit. The only way to stop feeding it was to ride it down without wanting anything it was passing through, to go through every floor between the 6th and the ground and keep still. Theo looked at the elevator gate at the end of the corridor for a long moment. He said, "So every time we ride it, it gets harder to leave?" I said yes. He said, "What's on the floors between here and the ground?" I said, "For you, 12 years of this building. The years your firm was on 9. The work, the people, all of it. He said, "And for you?" I said, "17, if you count the years before I was superintendent." He was quiet. Then he said, "What happens if one of us flinches?" I said I thought it pushed the ground floor back further, far enough, and there might not be enough present left to exit into. That was what the attendant was working toward in its patient, professional way, not through force, not through threat, just through the accumulated weight of what we kept giving it. Every time we named a year we had a reason to want. It had all the time it needed. It always had. Theo stood up and picked up his flashlight and looked at me. He said, "All right, let's go down." The car came when I called it. The attendant asked what floor. I said the ground floor, and we stepped in. The 5th floor doors opened first. The corridor from 7 years ago, lit and occupied, the building still fighting. I looked at it and kept my hands at my sides and did not step off. The 4th floor, the storage unit Theo had come to collect from, the corridor outside it, ordinary and unremarkable, except that it belonged to a year that no longer existed. He looked at it steadily. He kept still. The 3rd floor opened on the building from 11 years ago, the year I'd fully taken over, the year the Carrow Tower had become mine in the way that actually mattered. A woman was walking the corridor, head down, reading something, and I knew her before she was close enough to confirm. There was only one person who had walked the 3rd floor corridors with that particular stride in that year, a younger version of myself, one who still thought knowing a building well enough could save it from what was coming for it. I looked at the floor indicator. I looked at my hands. The doors stayed closed. We went down, the 2nd floor, the building full and the carpeting burgundy and everyone behind their partitions, doing the work of a busy place. I thought of nothing particular and kept still. The 1st floor. I hadn't tested the 1st floor before. The doors opened and I looked through the frosted glass of the office suite and understood immediately what year it was. Not by the building itself, but by what had been intact in my life during that year, what the following years had taken, the particular shape of things before the losses that reshaped everything. I put my hand on the gate. The corridor was lit and the offices were occupied, and behind that glass was everything that had been whole in a year. I would have given a great deal to be standing in. My hand was on the gate, and the gate was the only thing between me and it. I stood there with the attendant behind me and the corridor ahead of me, and I couldn't have told you how long I stood there. Long enough that the question of whether I was going to step off became a real question, not a theoretical one. Theo put his hand on my arm. He didn't say anything, just his hand on my arm. The simple weight of another person standing in the same moment, someone real and current and on the same side of the gate as me. I took my hand off the gate. I said, "Ground floor." The car went down. The lobby was the lobby I'd left that evening, empty and half-lit. Police placards in the windows, the directory with its blank lines, the floor I'd mopped on Monday, still holding the faint smell of the cleaner I used. Real and current and faintly sad, in the specific way the Carrow Tower was faintly sad. Present. We walked out. I drove Theo to his address across town, and he sat in the passenger seat, not talking for most of the drive, which was fine. Some things need the quiet of a moving car to settle into. When I pulled up outside his building, he sat there for a moment, before getting out. He said he'd need to come back for the storage unit at some point. I told him I'd leave the freight elevator unlocked, the one that only went to 4, the one with nothing in its shaft but the building as it currently was. He looked at me and said, "You kept your hands still." I said, "So did you." "Mostly." He almost smiled. He said, "Not on 9. My firm's floor. The year the work was good. I almost didn't make it." I said, "I know, I was watching." He said, "How did you manage the first floor?" I thought about the weight of his hand on my arm. Someone else in the elevator. Someone standing in the present alongside me. I said, "I wasn't alone in the car." He nodded like that made complete sense to him. He said goodnight and went inside. I drove back to the Carrow Tower because the water pressure issue was still unresolved, and the building was my responsibility, and the job didn't pause because I'd had a night that changed the shape of things. I found the partial blockage where I'd expected it, cleared it, confirmed the pressure was running even across the secondary feed. Then I went to the basement. The gate to the service elevator was open. The car was there. The attendant inside, white gloves folded, cap straight, waiting with the infinite patience of something that has never needed to be in a hurry. I shut the exterior gate and went to the manual lockout on the power panel, a physical lever into a slot, the kind of mechanical certainty that had no interest in being anything other than what it was. I engaged it. From behind the gate, after a moment, I heard the indicator needle begin cycling through the floors. Not the car. The car was locked, the drum disengaged, the cable slack. Just the needle, moving through the numbers on its own, up through the floors, and back down again, continuous and unhurried. I turned off the basement lights and went home. I come back in the morning. I always come back. The Carrow Tower needs someone who knows it, and I know it better than anyone. That's the job. The 3 remaining tenants have needs, the systems have needs, and the building itself has needs in the way that old buildings have needs. The constant small requirements of something large and aging that has learned to depend on being attended to. I check the manual lockout every morning before anything else. 30 seconds. Lever in the slot, car down, power disconnected. It is the first thing I do when I reach the basement, and I do it before I look at anything else. The indicator is always cycling when I check. I can hear the needle moving through the floors before I reach the panel. I do not look at it. I look at the lever, confirm it's where I left it, and I go upstairs. Some nights, when the building is quiet and it's past midnight and the work is done, and I'm doing one last walkthrough before I leave, I think about the first floor, the lit corridor, the year behind that glass, and everything that year still had in it. How long I stood at the gate before Theo's hand on my arm brought me back. I think about what the attendant was built to understand, that the right offer, made to the right person in the right moment, doesn't need to force anything. It just needs to know which floor you'd name if you let yourself, and wait for the moment when keeping your hands still gets hard enough. The building is what it is now. The Carrow Tower in its current form, 3 tenants and too many blank lines on the directory, and all the floors that used to mean something sitting empty above the ones that still do. It is what I have. I know the difference between preserving something and being consumed by it most days, and on the days that distinction gets harder to hold, I think about Theo's hand on my arm, and I think about walking out through a lobby that was finally actually the present. I check the lockout. The needle cycles through the floors. I go upstairs and do the work.